Hello people, and welcome to Crypto Exposed. CNBC says Ripple's new strategy puts XRP at the center of a financial revolution. Okay guys, let's get into it. Okay, so this was them covering Ripple off of the back of the Swell event, which is obviously their meetups where they talk about Ripple and XRP. And yeah, I'll be honest with you, for the most part, I do agree with this. And so this is just something I thought I'd cover because, you know, one of the many, things that's going around at the moment with Ripple and XRP is Ripple abandoning XRP. And so not to beat a dead horse with this one, but just another thing to talk about why, for me, I do still feel that, you know, like Ripple are going to continue to try and put XRP, in their best interest to try and get it adopted. And so look, the first thing I want to accept and acknowledge here, because I am always transparent with the audience when it comes to this, have Ripple pivoted to a degree in regards to not just focusing on XRP? Yes, they have. Look, that's just the absolute truth. Like, I'm just going to be completely real here. Obviously they've created RLUSD, which, don't get me wrong, when they created RLUSD, I think there was two reasons why they did it, but the main important reason why they did it at the time was actually because of the SEC versus Ripple lawsuit. And so what was happening was, they were having to use USDT as the bridge asset when they were doing ODL/Ripple payments in the US, right? Because the lawsuit was going on, so they couldn't use XRP as the bridge asset during that time in the US because it was going through the lawsuit. And so they were using Tether. And basically, I think what they just realized is, hey, we're using Tether here, USDT, as the bridge asset, and we're just helping them make a load of money. Why don't we just create our own stablecoin, right? And that way we can at least get some, volume out of our own stablecoin and help increase the value of our own stablecoin rather than making another one richer. And the other thing is, I think they just saw that the stablecoin market is huge, right? It's clearly a massive market, and it's growing even bigger and bigger. And so I do think it's a thing where they thought, yeah, business wise, this makes sense. And so they've created their own stablecoin. And so look, I'm not here to act like there hasn't been a pivot with Ripple's strategy. Absolutely there has. I do think when they first started out, XRP was completely the sole focus. And I think the thing that's happened here is two things. I think one, the SEC lawsuit has obviously put a dampener on things because, one thing I will say is David Schwartz mentioned when the lawsuit was first announced, and they actually said they had a really big partnership in the works. He never mentioned who it was, but he said that there was this big partnership in the works. And then once the lawsuit was announced, they said, hey, look, we're going to just step back for a minute. We'll let you guys figure this out. And, once that's done, we'll come back to you. And he said, look, that just never occurred, right? Like, they stepped back and that was the end of it. So the SEC did really do damage to Ripple and XRP. This is the thing that I've said before. Like, while Ripple did win in the end, they won the war, they did lose a few battles along the way, right? So, like, the SEC, while they didn't get exactly what they wanted because they would have wanted to win the lawsuit as well, they did manage to hinder some of Ripple and XRP's growth. Absolutely. Like, when I think back now to, let's just say that the lawsuit never occurred. Let's just say never occurred. Where would XRP be right now? Like, what other partnerships would Ripple and XRP have had, right? And what price would XRP be? So like, I do question like those types of things. So I think it's clear to see that the SEC did have an impact, even if they wasn't successful in their ultimate goal, which obviously we are grateful for. And so I think that was the one thing that played a part in it. And two, look, I think we have just got to accept that we can see that Ripple are competition now. They've gone for a banking license. So this isn't a thing anymore where they're just trying to make a product like Ripple Payments /ODL. It's not a thing where they're trying to make some products for banks anymore. They're actually competing against banks. Like, that's their direct competition. And so you've got to understand that this is a point now where it's different to where they were before. They're in a completely different position now. And so when it comes to XRP being adopted, I do think that's had an impact. I do think Ripple wanting to proposition themselves against the banks and compete with the banks, it does mean that maybe some of these banks are not going to want to use XRP anymore, because why are they going to want to use something that's going to benefit Ripple? Because they hold the escrow, right? So this is where, like, when I look at the whole stablecoin thing, I do think part of it, and I'm just speculating here just to be clear, like, I do think part of it could be that they just don't want Ripple to be successful, right? Because the tech of XRP, in my opinion, it speaks for itself, right? We know what it can do. So it makes logical sense to use the XRP ledger, but maybe they're thinking the more that obviously XRP would be adopted if they were to use the XRP ledger and XRP, the bigger this would ultimately make Ripple, right? And so it might be a thing of, hey, we're not going to use this if it's going to help Ripple get bigger when they're in the finance field. Do you see what I mean? They're like literally like becoming a bank, and it could make Ripple huge. And so I really do think there's a lot more to it when it comes to, you know, the whole stablecoin narrative being utilized over, you know, XRP as a bridge asset, because, you know, just speaking on it very vaguely, because I've covered this already recently, XRP, to me, it is just a logical choice. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that you have to use it, I get that, but if you just don't want to touch another country's stablecoin, etc., like, it does just make sense. Like, and even if it was a thing where they still want to use the US dollar, like, it still just makes sense to just use, you know, the XRP ledger anyway. It still can just make logical sense to use that regardless. So, yeah, I'm not going to beat a dead horse with that one either. I'm going to move on from that. But yeah, like, at the end of the day, I do accept and acknowledge that, you know, Ripple have pivoted a bit. That is just a 100% truth. Like, there's no denying that. But this is the thing for me. When we look at the whole aspect of, you know, Ripple buying Hidden Road, the clearing company, right? All these things that they've been doing, these acquisitions, it's to make Ripple bigger and to expand what they can provide. But it's also putting these things on the XRP ledger, right? Like, so for example, Hidden Road, all that volume will be on the XRP ledger. And I think this is where, okay, look, we can all acknowledge, would it be better to just use XRP as the asset to do all these transactions? Yeah, it would. But at the same time, let's just look at it from the other perspective. Even if they say, okay, we're going to use RLUSD because that's just where everybody's heading, right? That's just what everybody's doing. They're doing stablecoins, but it's going to be on the XRP ledger. That's still bringing huge amounts of volume to the XRP ledger. And this is why I say, like, well, yes, I acknowledge that XRP being the token being used would be the best thing. It's still bringing a lot of credibility to the XRP ledger anyway. And so I still think this will add to XRP's value overall because it's the native token of the network, right? Like, think about it like this. If you just look around and you start seeing, let's just say 5 years time, let's just say they've built way more and they've brought more companies and they've got this huge empire of, you know, companies, which they already have, but they've just built on top of that. And all these companies that they're using, that they've brought, that they're all basically, having all the volume flowing through the XRP ledger. Well, does that not add to the credibility of the XRP ledger? And then knowing that XRP is the gas token of it, and then that could make people want to invest in XRP. Because this is the thing, like, there's many networks that do this, right? There's many networks where they're not propositioning the main token to do all the transfers. It's just the gas token. So this isn't like unique to XRP. And I think this is the thing, because the whole role of XRP being utilized as a bridge asset was such a strong advertisement. I think people just look at that as the only way that it could be hugely successful, and that just doesn't have to be the case. If you've got all these companies that are doing like trillions or billions in volume, you know, on a yearly basis, and you've got all that flowing through the XRP ledger, that's a lot of volume on chain. That's a lot of volume then going onto that network, right? And they'll be saying, yeah, it's the XRP token that fuels all this through the gas, as the gas token, right? And so this is where, again, like, you might think, okay, the XRP ledger sounds really good. How's a way that I can invest in the XRP ledger, the XRP network? How's a way that I can invest in that? Oh, well, if I just hold XRP, yeah, that seems like that's the asset, that's the gas token. So I'll invest in XRP, and that's me believing in and investing in the XRP network overall, right? The XRP ledger. And this is how things work. Like, I just still think that you can still gain value from XRP through these things, even if it's not XRP directly being utilized, right? XRP still being used as the gas token. It's still fueling the network. it's still huge volumes of the network. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying here this is going to be one of those things where XRP being used to these high degrees is just going to make the price fly up. I don't believe that, but I do believe that when it comes to these valuations for companies, like when we talk about utility, right? I think what people need to understand is people think about like the utility literally equaling price. That's not necessarily how it works. What it is that people are seeing these things that are happening. So for example, partnerships, companies using these crypto networks and stuff like that. And then that makes other people speculate, right? It makes them look at it and say, oh wow, like the XRP ledger is handling, all of Hidden Road's now, all their transactions, etc. on the XRP ledger. Wow, that's pretty good. Maybe that's a network worth investing in. Oh wow, there's banks and institutions that are using XRP as a bridge asset for cross-border payments. Wow, that's pretty cool. That sounds like a network worth investing in. Let me buy some XRP, right? They can either buy Ripple, the company, or they can buy XRP. So this is where it's like, it's the fact that they're going to put these things on the XRP ledger that is going to make it more valuable. And I think that's where the value will come. Now, if you heard that, Ripple had turned around and said, hey, we've got this clearing company, but we're going to do it through Ethereum because Ethereum is just the top 2 network and we're going to do it through them instead, I absolutely would be concerned at that point, right? Like I would absolutely be worried about that. But that's not what they're doing. They're putting it on the XRP ledger. And so all this stuff that they're buying, all these companies, they're doing it via the XRP ledger, which is adding to its utility. It's adding to its usage, right? That's bringing huge volumes of payments and stuff flowing through the XRP ledger. So that is going to equal value. It is. So it might not be the value that you might have wanted in terms of, oh, we just want XRP to be the token used and not RLUSD. And look, I'm with you there. I would rather that myself as well. But let's just accept that even though that's not the case, that is still going to add value overall to the token. It is over the long term. And it's going to add longevity as well, because while that company is owned by Ripple, all these companies that they have, it's going to continue to be used. Right? So you're not going to worry that, XRP is just going to die at some point, because while Ripple have these companies, all that volume and all those payments are going to flow through the XRP ledger. So longevity wise, it's there, And so this is where I say, like, if you're just thinking that it's like utility just equals price, it doesn't necessarily work like that. It's people still speculating on it. That's still what it equates to. It's people looking at these networks, seeing these things and thinking that they deem it valuable. They deem these networks valuable, or these tokens are valuable because of the things that they can do. And then you get into the supply and demand factor, right? So let's just say you've got these people thinking, okay, we think this is a valuable asset. So they buy a lot of XRP. That means the exchanges might be running low on their supply. And then let's say the demand factor comes in, right? More people need stuff to do things like developers might need more XRP to do transactions and to do, things that they're trying to test the dApps and stuff like that. All these types of use cases that they're bringing in. But the supply is lower. So what happens? The price has to go up. Do you see what I mean? So it's a lot more realistic than just, oh, the utility equals that this price is going to go to this. It's not. And that's why when I talk about like the $10,000 stuff, you can't put a price on these things. You can't put a price on what people are going to go to pay to be willing to have XRP or whatever. Like, you don't know. So it's a thing where having these types of use cases, all this stuff that Ripple are doing, is ultimately going to add to its value over time. Now, to what degree? I can't say. We'll have to see over time. But that's where the more things that Ripple can do, the more partnerships they can get, the more adoption they can get for the XRP ledger, the more institutions and people and governments and whatever may deem it a valuable asset and want to utilize it more, or just buy it for more of a store of value, for example, or because they deem it a valuable asset. And that's what will help ultimately with the supply and demand. So it does add, but it's not the way people think it is. So yes, I do think that Ripple's strategy is to get XRP more adopted. I do think that's what will help to its value overall in the long term. And that's why, again, like, even though, yes, I can admit they have pivoted, and yes, they are now putting RLUSD as part of their business strategy. The way I look at it is this, right? If the world is going to stablecoins, where they're using a stablecoin, they're using it where it's necessary, right? So they're not going to say like if XRP is the better choice, they're not going to say, well, we're just going to use RRUSD anyway, right? So let's just say, for example, with transfers within the US, they'll probably just use a stablecoin because that just makes logical sense. But if they're doing transfers cross-border, they'll probably use XRP because it is the more logical and obvious choice to use. So I don't think it's a thing where they're just going to now say, we'll just use stablecoins and that's it. I think they will still use XRP where it makes sense to use it. But I think that's what it is. Like where originally the whole goal was just XRP completely, I think they're saying, okay, well, we've got the stablecoin. We'll use the stablecoin where other people are just using stablecoins. Because, you know, like I said this before, like for the people who are going to want to use stablecoins, they wasn't going to use XRP anyway. Do you see what I mean? Like they wasn't going to use XRP anyway. So it's better that at least Ripple have got the option of saying, well, if you don't want to use XRP, we've got the stablecoin there. That's just giving them an alternative option, right? Because some people might have said, well, if all you've got is XRP, I'll just use something else altogether. So this is where Ripple can say, well, we've got the stablecoin or we've got XRP. Use whichever one you want. Do you see what I mean? And I still think that where it makes sense, Ripple will utilize XRP. But where it doesn't, they'll use the stablecoin. And that's fair enough. I would much rather it was just XRP, of course, but I can just be a realist and say that's fair enough. As a company, they're doing what makes sense and giving people an alternative option. And for the people who don't want to use XRP, they wasn't going to use it in the first place. So if they're using the stablecoin, that's why they wanted to use it, because they wasn't going to use XRP. So overall, I think this does make sense. And like I say, I still just see that Ripple are trying to make XRP, you know, more worthwhile and valuable over its adoption by putting these acquisitions and stuff, putting all these companies that they're getting through the XRP ledger. And to me, that's going to equal value over time, long term. Thank you very much for watching this. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And hit that bell. Take care.